Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Dash, and I'm a forester and remote sensing scientist at Scion. I'm going to talk about one of our projects, improving small plantation and woodlot inventory, which is a research project that we had until recently. This was a collaboration between my colleagues at Scion, but also some colleagues in our counterparts in Norway. This is a bit of an overview of the contents of my talk. It's quite a large amount of different things we covered. I can't cover off on all of it, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background, a bit of context, and from there talk about two specific research themes before trying to bring it together in a somewhat timely fashion. Okay, so a little bit of background by way of introduction, some rationale to why we did this research. I suppose we did this because we came to a realization a few years ago that the research, remote sensing, so that's RS, remote sensing solutions, which have been researched, developed, and implemented very successfully across New Zealand and Australia and elsewhere in the world, are not particularly well suited to woodlots, to smaller forests, and there's a number of reasons for this, some of which I've listed on the board. So there's sometimes a requirement for a large sample size, depending on the modeling technique which is used, particularly for the popular non-parametric modeling technique, k-nearest neighbor. You know, if you have a sample size requirement of, say, let's imagine 200 plots for a large estate, not so bad, but to accumulate that into a woodlot's probably not feasible. Smaller growers or smaller forest growers, I shouldn't get that right, generally don't have access to the economies of scale for smaller areas, so some remote sensing technology such as LiDAR, it can be expensive, but for a large grower, for a large estate, the cost per hectare can reduce dramatically. And then, of course, there are some complexities of in the data processing, the statistical analysis, which might be required, some in-house expertise, or for the engagement of consultants, which comes at some expense. Over and above that, I think that woodlots are actually a really interesting real-world sampling problem. I think they're awkward size to measure efficiently. They're large enough and variable enough to require a reasonable sample size, but too small to invest in an extensive field measurement, or perhaps they're perceived to be in some instances, and so an adequate sample size may not be collected. So perhaps some real-world scenarios may occur something like this, that a grower might contact a forest inventory contractor, and the forest inventory contractor will very diligently and professionally assess how many plots are required to assess the variability in a woodlot, and it's too expensive for the grower. And so a situation might arrive where the grower says, well, you know, what can you do in a day? Might be 8 plots. What can you do in a couple of days? Might be 16 plots. Can we rely on the estimates from a small sample size like that? Well, I don't know. They could be misleading, better than no plots at all, but maybe misleading. And even above and beyond that, of course, it's very regular practice to calculate precision estimates on that very small number of plots. And can we rely on the estimates of precision, or PLE, which have been calculated from 8 plots? Well, maybe not. I don't know. So with that in mind, in that context, the goal of our project was to really look at addressing this niche and carry out some research that improves small plantation and woodlot inventory if we could. We wanted to investigate approaches that make measurement more cost-effective or make measurement better, to make the benefits of remotely sensed data and the novel statistical methods which support them available specifically to woodlot growers. And this should include both existing data, so data sets that have already been collected, maybe for non-forestry purposes, and then new data, so emerging data sources as well, things like UAVs, whether we can deliver those benefits to growers. So I'm going to move on. That was my introduction. I'm going to move on to a couple of specific research themes, and the first one that we looked at was really around this idea of UAVs for forest inventory. So when we started this 2 years ago, the market, let's say, was less evolved than it is now. But UAVs were emerging and becoming more and more available, and we asked ourselves, can we develop methods that might be able to make UAVs useful for small plantation inventory? We know that we can collect imagery, we know we can collect data from these things, but can we integrate that data into a forest inventory context? And to have a look at that, we put in place a case study. So Jeff Tomlinson's in the room. This is his forest. Our case study is in Horohoro, just outside of Rotorua. I would describe it as a fairly typical New Zealand woodlot. You may think otherwise. It's about 40 hectares or so, planted in 1993. It's radiata. It's managed in a forestry right. It's probably coming up for harvest sometime fairly soon, I guess. Inside this woodlot, we put in place a very intensive field sampling campaign, so 30 circular bounded 0.06 hectare plots. Nothing particularly unusual in here, just collected some field measurements, overlapping feature crews, and of course collected a high-grade GPS point in the center of these plots, so we knew exactly where they were. To go along with that, we acquired some remote sensing data. So we acquired UAV and conventional remote sensing data for this woodlot. So when I talk about conventional, I'm talking about manned aircraft. Of course, the UAV is what we're interested in, but the conventional plane data gives us this gold standard of data that we can understand fairly well. I don't know why the formatting's changed there. But from both the conventional aircraft and from the UAV, we collected ALS data, which is ALS for me is airborne laser scanning, so that's LiDAR data, and we had UAV laser scanning from the UAV. And essentially the data sets that we collect from those two platforms are the same, although they have different properties. So from the UAV, you can see we've got 700 pulses per meter squared, and from the aircraft, in this particular case, we had around 10 pulses per meter squared. We also find that the footprint from the UAV, by the time the laser pulse hits the vegetation on the ground, is somewhat smaller, and the spacing of points that we get on the ground is also closer together from the UAV. So it's denser, but as I said, the conventional aircraft provides us with this gold standard. We know how to work with this data. We know what the accuracy levels of it, and so it's useful as a comparison. Now, we're really lucky at Scion that we have funds that we can use to buy things like laser scanners that can be mounted onto UAVs. So they're expensive, they're difficult to work with. If you crash them, you get into a lot of trouble. But perhaps that's not a conventional scenario for lots and lots of people who might want to collect this information. So we looked at another data set which might be more of a real-world example as well, something that's more feasible. So the laser scanning data that we provide, we call this an active remote sensing data source. So it emits its own energy in the form of laser pulses, and some of those laser pulses penetrate the canopy and are reflected from the ground below. And when that happens, we get an accurate representation of the terrain below the forest, so a digital terrain model, and we can use that to normalize the point cloud, which is generated from the laser scanner. Another way that you can generate a point cloud is using a passive remote sensing technique. So in this case here, I'm talking about something that we call structure from motion. So structure from motion is a method to derive 3D information about a forest canopy or anything else really, which is just simply derived from overlapping imagery using a conventional camera. So no lasers involved, no penetration through to the ground, and so we don't get a good digital terrain model from these point clouds, although we do get good information on the top third of the canopy, as you may be able to see over in this kind of picture on the side here. So it's low cost, doesn't require specialist equipment other than a camera and a UAV, although it does require some software which is commercially available to generate this 3D structure. And there's a couple of different ways that you can use it, a couple of different scenarios. So it may be that you have a pre-existing understanding of what the terrain is like under your forest, and in that case you can use the pre-existing digital terrain model to normalize that point cloud, which doesn't get a view of the ground, so that you have accurate information on the true heights of your trees and the true structure of your canopy. In some scenarios, we'll never have that information. So we don't have national LiDAR coverage in New Zealand, unfortunately. So if you wanted to do this, in some cases, you wouldn't have a pre-existing accurate terrain model. And so we wanted to explore both of these situations, one which I call SFM DTM, where the SFM point cloud is being corrected using a digital terrain model, and one where it hasn't. So it's completely digital terrain model independent. A very, very low-cost remote sensing data source. So with our field plots and our remote sensing data in hand, the next step in any process, any model-based or model-assisted inventory approach is to develop some kind of model that allows you to extrapolate the field plots out to the remote sensing data. And we did this. We did this very carefully, and I won't go into the details of what we did. Although I will say that we used multiple linear regression models, and I will say that we selected our variables carefully. And there's a few key points that I will highlight from this process. We found that the structure from motion, so the image-based point clouds, once it was normalized with a digital terrain model, and the UAV laser scanning provided the best possible models for stand height that we could generate. So we believe that's because the very, very high resolution data that you get from a UAV is more capable of resolving the tops of the trees than our conventional LiDAR data set. We found that the structure from motion, DTM, outperformed the UAV laser scanning and the conventional laser scanning from LiDAR from the aircraft in the prediction of volume. We found that the spectral metrics, which we extracted from the imagery, were useful for predicting several stand attributes. So not just the structure that we were able to derive about the canopy, but also the color of the canopy as well. So its greenness or whatever it might be. We found that even without a terrain model, the structure from motion metrics were useful for predicting some attributes, although perhaps unsurprisingly not height. So, with our models in place, we examined 3 inferential or sampling frameworks for these data sources, and they're kind of shown in this picture on the right-hand side of the slide, my right. And these 3 different scenarios that we have here are really, let me explain the picture. We have these circles which represent the field plots, and this funny colored thing represents the remote sensing data over there. So we have these 3 different scenarios where we have field data only, which we're all very, very familiar with. And we have very well established statistical methods for estimating the means of that population and for estimating the variance associated with it. So that's our baseline, where we have plots only. Then we wanted to look at a scenario where we have UAV data, which covers the entirety of the woodlot. So you can imagine that this is feasible in a case where you have a smaller woodlot. You might be able to, an inventory crew might be able to get out there, collect some plots for a few days or for however long it might be, and then cover the entirety of the woodlot. So everywhere in that forest we have UAV data. And we refer to this as model-based. We use model-based inference in this scenario, and thanks to the fantastic work from our collaborators in Norway, we have suitable statistical frameworks for estimating the variance and for the means of both the model-based and the next scenario as well. Now, the next scenario that I'm talking about here is shown by the picture on the bottom, is partial coverage. So in this scenario, we have some plots across our forest, and then we have a situation where we're able to put a UAV up, but we're not able to capture UAV data wall to wall over the woodlot. So you can imagine for larger woodlots, this situation might arise. And we refer to this as partial coverage, and we refer to the estimator that we have as hybrid inference. So some of the results that we came up with are shown in this slide here. Here, my picture shows on the y-axis, my graph shows for model-based wall-to-wall at the top, and for partial coverage at the bottom, we're showing the relative efficiency. And for 4 different stand parameters, so we've got height, N is number of trees per hectare or stocking, basal area, and total standing volume. And you can see in this case that the relative efficiency shows that a relative efficiency of 3, I should say, means that you would need 3 times as many plots with plots only to provide this level of efficiency when incorporating the UAV data. But I'll just finish off now by saying that including the remote sensing data almost always enhance the efficiency compared to using plots alone. Efficiency gains were greatest with wall-to-wall estimation, but partial coverage offers a viable option as well. The gains in efficiency vary by forest sensor platform and variable. So in conclusion to this UAV section, we've developed and trialed new statistical estimators that allow this UAV data to be incorporated into woodlot inventory. We've shown that this can be applied when we have wall-to-wall data or partial coverage, and we found that there can be significant gains in precision there. We've also shown that UAV data can be as accurate as more traditional plane-based remote sensing. I'm going to very quickly now just talk about this other theme from the project, which is really, I refer to this as a community approach. And I think somebody talked about it earlier, about small growers working together. I think it was in a harvesting context to gain the efficiencies of a larger grower, I suppose. And I'm interested in this as well, but from, I suppose, a forest inventory point of view. And we kind of wondered whether we could set up a scenario where a large community of growers work together and through prudent data sharing could access the benefits of pre-existing remote sensing data and make these available to small forest growers as if altogether they were one large grower. How many growers have we got in, small growers have we got in New Zealand? 14,000, 16,000, I don't know. But altogether, I guess they're the largest forest grower. So really we kind of thought about a conceptual framework for how this might work, and we thought it might be something like this, that a forest owner might register with a system or access a piece of software on the internet where they might register and provide some information about their forest, at least, provide the forest boundaries, the species, planting year, whatever information that they might have. If they have measured their 8 plots, you know, there's a single day of measurement at a relatively low cost, they might provide those plots as well. And the plots could be added to a communal database, which could be accessed by all of the users, all of the community engaged in this project. Using the forest boundaries, which have been provided from a GIS, the little conceptual framework software would go away and carry out a spatial query which identifies the most relevant free and open access remote sensing data sets available in the system. And then all of the relevant reference plots which have been provided by the community of users would be used to model forest yields and to return yield tables to the forest owner. And so we wanted to put in place a proof of concept to show that this is possible, and this is exactly what we did. We had a look around New Zealand for where we might be able to put in place a case study of this type. The yellow on this map shows all of the open access data sets. Of course, there are a lot more which are collected by the corporate forest growers. All right, I'm going to just finish off now. And the hatched areas are planned, actually. But we identified that the southern North Island had a fantastic data set that we might be able to work with in terms of LiDAR. And so we grabbed some data from there. We were able to identify forest boundaries, acquired a network of plot data, and fitted models of forest yields. You know, even in this proof of concept stage, they look quite promising. We were able to produce region-wide maps of forest yields, log product volumes, and all things that might be useful to foresters, and the validation suggests that it seems to be working reasonably well. So in this project, we've delivered new solutions using emerging technologies in a manner that is suitable for small forest growers. We have new methods for generating cost-effective 3D information on forest structure from UAVs, and we've developed this proof of concept for a plot-sharing approach for the community of small forest growers using open access and free remote sensing data. Some outputs, much more detail in all of those available, and thank you very much. I'm probably out of time.